The opulent meeting room of Kim Corporation exuded power and prestige, with its floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a breathtaking view of Seoul's skyline. The large mahogany table in the center gleamed under the soft lighting, surrounded by leather chairs that seemed almost too luxurious to sit in. Kim Corporation, the biggest business empire in South Korea, was at the pinnacle of the corporate world, and its CEO, Kim Taehyung, sat at its helm like a king ruling his empire. Kim Taehyung, dressed impeccably in a sharp black three-piece suit, sat at the head of the table, his piercing eyes observing every movement, every nervous tick of his guests. He exuded confidence and authority, his presence alone enough to make the room feel smaller. His secretary, Park Hana, stood beside him, holding a tablet, her expression as calm and professional as ever. Across from him sat the Lisa group of men who looked polished on the surface, but whose desperation was visible if one looked closely enough. Mr. Lee, the CEO of Lee Enterprises, had aged far beyond his years due to the recent turmoil in his business. Beside him was his younger brother, Juan, who appeared far less composed, fidgeting with his pen. Ji-hoon, Mr. Lee's son, was seated next to his father, his face carefully blank but his eyes betraying his discomfort. Two more individuals, a business partner and a secretary, sat on either side, trying to appear stoic. Taehyung's deep voice broke the silence, his tone sharp yet controlled. "Gentlemen, let's cut to the chase. You need me more than I need you. I am well aware of Lee Enterprises' current situation: massive losses, dwindling shares, and increasing debt. Am I wrong?" Mr. Lee stiffened, his hands tightening around the file in front of him. "Mr. Kim, we admit we've faced some challenges, but this collaboration will be mutually beneficial. With Kim Corporation's resources and Lee Enterprises' expertise in logistics." Taehyung raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "Mr. Lee, I'm not here for a lecture on your expertise. I know your strengths, just as I know your weaknesses. I've reviewed the proposal. It's acceptable." A collective sigh of relief escaped the Lees. Mr. Lee exchanged glances with Juan, who nodded subtly, as if to say, "We're finally saved." Taehyung leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. However, the word hung in the air like a storm cloud, immediately putting everyone back on edge. "I have one condition," Taehyung said, his voice calm yet laced with a sinister undertone. The Lees froze. Mr. Lee glanced at his brother, who seemed equally puzzled. Finally, Mr. Lee spoke, his voice wary. "And what condition would that be, Mr. Kim?" Taehyung's smirk deepened as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His eyes bore into Mr. Lee's to ensure that there is no misunderstanding or fraud in this collaboration. "I require one thing, Mr. Lee. You must marry your daughter, Lee Wai-lin, to me." The room fell into stunned silence. Mr. Lee shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What?" Juan quickly grabbed his brother's arm, pulling him back into his seat. "Hyung, calm down, Mr. Lee snapped, glaring at his brother. "Did you hear what he just said? He wants me too." Taehyung interrupted with a cold laugh, leaning back in his chair as though the outburst amused him. "It's a simple condition. Your daughter marries me, and I sign the deal, otherwise ... He gestured toward the door with mock politeness. "There's the exit. Good luck finding another investor who can pull you out of bankruptcy." Juan turned to Taehyung, desperation evident in his voice. "Mr. Kim, this is ... unconventional. Surely there's another way." Taehyung raised an eyebrow, his smirk fading into a deadly serious expression. "Unconventional, perhaps, but this is my company, Mr. Juan, not a family-run charity. If you're not interested, I won't waste any more time." Mr. Lee slammed his fist on the table. "This is absurd. My daughter is not a bargaining chip, Mr. Kim. I will not throw her into this." Devil's Den. Ji-hoon, who had remained silent until now, spoke up hesitantly. "Mr. Kim, I'm already married to your sister." Surely that solidifies the connection between our families. Taehyung stood abruptly, buttoning his coat with an air of finality. His smirk returned, but this time it was accompanied by an unmistakable edge of mockery. Very well, Mr. Lee. It seems we have nothing further to discuss. I wish you all the best. In finding your way out of bankruptcy, he began walking toward the door, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. Desperation wait. Juwon's voice rang out, desperate and shaky. Mr. Kim, please. Taehyung paused, turning slightly, his expression one of utter boredom. Yes. Juwon swallowed hard, his eyes darting to his brother, who looked ready to explode. Give us ... give us some time to think about it. Taehyung's smirk widened. 3 days it is. I'll expect an answer by then. He turned fully to face them, his gaze sweeping over each man at the table. Choose wisely, gentlemen. My patience has its limits. With that, he walked out of the room, his victorious smile lingering long after the door closed behind him. As soon as Taehyung left, the room erupted. What have you done, Juwon? Mr. Lee demanded, his face red with anger. You're asking me to sell my daughter's life to save this company. Juwon slammed his hands on the table, his frustration matching his brother's. Hyung, we don't have a choice. If we lose this deal, we lose everything. The company, our reputation, our future, it will all be gone. Mr. Lee shook his head, sinking back into his chair. And you think sacrificing and is the solution? I won't do it. I won't let her marry that devil. Ji-hoon spoke up again, his voice hesitant. Maybe I can talk to Aera. She might convince her brother to reconsider. Juwon sighed, rubbing his temples. It's worth a try, but if Aera fails ... he looked at his brother grimly. We may not have any other options. Mr. Lee stared at the table, his heart heavy. How did it come to this? The Lee household was filled with an oppressive silence, one that weighed heavily on everyone in the room. Mr. Lee sat in his armchair, his hands gripping the sides as if holding onto his sanity. His wife, Mrs. Lee, stood near the dining table, her hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. Juwon paced the room nervously, while his wife sat stiffly on the couch, looking anywhere but at the fiery gazes of her in-laws. Ji-hoon, standing by the window, clenched his fists, trying to think of a way to prevent the inevitable. Mrs. Lee finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with emotion. There has to be another way ... we can't do this. I can't throw my daughter into the hands of that ... That monster. Do you think I want this? Mr. Lee snapped, his voice raw with frustration and pain. I love Wyden, she's my daughter. Do you think I can bear to see her sacrificed like this? Mrs. Lee finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with emotion. There has to be another way ... we can't do this. I can't throw my daughter into the hands of that ... That monster. Do you think I want this? Mr. Lee snapped, his voice raw with frustration and pain. I love Wyden, she's my daughter. Do you think I can bear to see her sacrificed like this? Mrs. Lee shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. Then why are we even considering it? There has to be someone else who can help us. There's no one. Juwon's voice rose, cutting her off. He stopped pacing and turned to face them, his expression desperate. We've tried everything, talked to everyone. No one is willing to help. This collaboration with Kim Corporation is our last chance to save Lee Enterprises. If we lose it, we lose everything, our business, our homes, our reputation. We'll be on the streets. Mrs. Lee covered her mouth, tears spilling over. But why and how can we do this to her, that man? He's infamous for his anger, his ruthlessness. There are rumors about what he did to his first wife. Exactly, Mr. Lee roared, standing up abruptly. Kim Taehyung isn't just ruthless in business, he's uncontrollable. He destroyed his first wife with his anger. And you want me to send my daughter to him over my dead body? Ji-hoon cleared his throat, breaking the heated argument. I'll talk to Aera. Maybe she can reason with her brother. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his coat and stepped out. Moments later, Jihoon stood in the lavish living room of Kim Taehyung's mansion, facing Taehyung's younger sister, Kim Aera. Aera raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. You want me to convince my brother to drop his condition? Are you serious, Jihoon? Jihoon nodded. Aera, you know how difficult he can be, but you're his sister. He listens to you. Please talk to him. This condition ... It's unreasonable. Aera scoffed, shaking her head. Jihoon, you seem to forget something important. Taehyung isn't just my brother, he's my father's nephew. We're half siblings, not full, and he barely listens to me on personal matters. Do you really think he'll change his mind because I ask him to? Aera, please, Jihoon pleaded, his voice softening. You're the only one who can help us. Wyden doesn't deserve this. Aera sighed, looking genuinely regretful. I tried talking to him when I heard about this, Jihoon. Believe me, I did, but he shut me down before I could even finish my sentence. He's dead set on this, and you know how he is when he's made up his mind. I'm sorry. Jihoon exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Then what do we do? He's forcing this marriage as a condition for the collaboration. My family is falling apart. Aera placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry, Jihoon. But if you want to save your company, you'll have to play by his rules. Jihoon returned to a scene of utter chaos. Mrs. Lee sat on the couch, crying softly, while Mr. Lee paced the room, his face a mask of anger and frustration. Juwon stood off to the side, trying to make his case. Hyung, we don't have a choice, Juwon said firmly. If we lose this collaboration, we lose everything. We'll be bankrupt. And you think selling Wyden to that man is the answer? Mr. Lee shot back, his voice thunderous. Over my dead body. Then be ready to see us all on the streets. Juwon yelled, throwing his hands in the air. You're so blinded by your love for Y, in that you're willing to let everyone suffer for it. You're willing to let the company collapse, to let everyone lose their jobs, just to protect her. What about the rest of us, Hyung? What about our families? Mrs. Juwon, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. Then what's the problem in marrying Wyden to him? If it saves the company and our livelihoods, isn't it worth it? Her words were met with stunned silence. Mr. Lee turned to her slowly, his eyes bloodshot with rage. Do you even hear yourself? You're talking about my daughter as if she's some kind of commodity. Mrs. Lee looked horrified, shaking her head. No, absolutely not. I won't allow it. So what? The voice echoed through the room, silencing everyone. They turned to see Wyden standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unbothered. Why, Wyden? Mrs. Lee stammered, her face paling. Wyden scoffed, stepping further into the room. Why the sudden concern for me? Huh? It's not like you guys have ever cared about what I want. Wyden, don't talk like that. Mr. Lee said firmly, his voice heavy with authority. What? Wyden shrugged nonchalantly. I'm just stating the truth. You're all so worried about losing the company, about going bankrupt. Fine, I'll marry him. A stunned silence filled the room. Mrs. Lee rushed to her daughter, grabbing her by the shoulders. Have you gone mad? Do you even know what you're saying? Wyden looked at her mother, her eyes cold. What are you so bothered about? It's not like my life matters to anyone here. I'll marry him. Problem solved. Mrs. Juwon clapped her hands together. Well, that settles it then. Shut up. Mr. Lee roared, silencing her instantly. Wyden, have you lost your mind? Do you even know what you're agreeing to? Wyden's lips curled into a bitter smile. I haven't lost anything, Appa, but you're about to lose a lot if this deal doesn't go through. Isn't that what you're worried about? Wyden, Mr. Lee began, but she cut him off. Enough, she said, her voice firm. I've made my decision, Uncle. Tell him I'll marry him. Juan, seeing the opportunity, quickly grabbed his phone and stepped out to call Taehyung. Juan, stop, Mr. Lee shouted, but his brother didn't listen. As Juan dialed Taehyung's number, he muttered to himself, "Sorry, Hyung, you're ready to go bankrupt, but I'm not." Inside, Widen turned and walked to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. Mrs. Lee collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. The house was left in shattered silence, each family member drowning in their own turmoil. Widen shut the door of her room with a soft thud and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. The weight of the argument downstairs was still heavy on her chest, but her expression wasn't one of despair, it was something else entirely. Determined, nervous, maybe a bit of both, she walked over to her bed, sitting on the edge as her fingers reached for her phone on the bedside table. Unlocking it, she navigated to her gallery, her thumb scrolling with precision until she found what she was looking for, a picture. The screen lit up with the image of a man, his sharp features softening under the sunlight captured in the photo. He looked calm, content, and the sight of him brought an involuntary smile to her face. Her fingers lightly brushed the screen, as if she could reach out and touch him. "I lost you once, ... double quotes," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. Her smile turned bittersweet, her eyes shimmering with inched tears. "But I won't lose you again." She stared at the photo for a long moment, as if drawing strength from it. Then her lips curved into a mischievous grin, and her eyes sparkled with a determination that hadn't been there before. "This is my chance," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "The last chance I'll ever get. And I won't let it slip away." Suddenly, a fit of giggles bubbled up in her throat, and she fell back onto her bed, clutching the phone to her chest. Her laughter filled the room as she kicked her legs in the air like a giddy teenager. She squealed, rolling onto her side and hugging her pillow. "I'm going to be your bride," she giggled again, burying her face in the pillow as her emotions swung wildly between excitement and disbelief. Seems like I've really lost it," she muttered, shaking her head with a smile. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Even if the world around her was chaotic, even if the marriage was forced and came with strings attached, Widen knew one thing: she wasn't stepping into this blindly. This wasn't about saving her father's company. It wasn't about protecting her family from ruin.